The river smelled of iron and cold stone when the dawn began to pale. And Edmure Tully stood on the battlements with his hands curled around the coarse crenelles, feeling the damp breathe cold into his knuckles. The tumblestone purled below him, a sound he knew from childhood naps taken on sun-warmed tiles, and from nights when he had crept up alone to watch torches threading like fireflies along the roads. This morning there were no laughter and no lazy flies, only the hushed clatter of men rising in the courtyards, and beyond, the flooded hush of the Red Fork and the distant low throb of hooves as outriders moved through mist. Family, duty, honor. The words came to him with the taste of river spray, not as a banner stitched to a hall, but as a weight on the shoulders, keener than mail. He swallowed it down like a draught of cold well water and turned when he heard his uncle's boots. Sir Brynden Tully, called the Blackfish by half the realm, and uncle by the half that mattered, came into that thin gray hour with his hair damp and his eyes bright, as if the river itself had climbed his limbs and settled there. A leather roll was tucked beneath his arm. Its wax seals had been broken in the night. "Scouts from the stone mill," Brynden said. His voice carried easily in the hush. Gold, crimson, a stiff west wind of them. Herds of cattle before the van. Meat on the hoof. Tywin is impatient. He will try the shallows. He will try everything. Then no. He always does, Edmure said. But he kept his tone level, for there was a second taste in his mouth this morning, bitter as willow bark. In his chest it felt like a fist he had tied shut with string. He was 30, and lord of Riverrun by necessity and grief, and in all those years he had not known that a man could burn with eagerness to throw open a gate and ride out, and yet hold himself still as if nailed to stone. "Obey me at the fords," Robb Stark had written in a neat, firm hand, words that had come by raven with the river fog, and had sat like a stone on Edmure's table all night. Dispositions followed, contingencies, the care of a commander who knew he was playing on a long board. "Let them come into the riverlands," the letter had urged. "Let them cross where they think us weakest. Then we close our hand. Do not give battle in the open field. Do not seek glory at the crossings. Hold them beyond the river. Hold them this side of the river. But let them think you are uncertain, until it is too late." And so Edmure had not sent Piper's men splashing after the first red-cloaked outriders they saw. He had damped Mark Piper's grin with a raised palm and soothed Carol Vance's old hurt with patient nods to Warcraft, and met Tyto's Blackwood's solemn eyes and said all the right words in the right order. He had signed orders to pull down ferries by night, to weaken the mill dam and rig it to burst, to seed caltrops in the shallows and sink sharpened stakes in the silt where the current ran treacherous. He had let his uncle distribute trout porters along the reed beds with tarred rope and grapnels, and he had sent boys with knives to cut the peasant fords into slick clay and false bottom. All this he did, and afterward he had come here to watch the river and bully himself not to pace. Brynden unrolled the damp vellum and pinned it with his thick fingers. "The mill," he said, tapping a spot with his nail, "will be their pride. The Lannisters think stone's their kin, but she's a river's toy, and the river is ours." Edmure smiled despite himself. He had learned as a boy to read the water as other boys had learned hawks. The tumblestone was a merry friend in summer, with clear ribs of current, but when swollen by rain it turned mean and clever. The Red Fork ran broader, lazier, and hid her strength under cattails and bright dragonflies. He could see in his mind where the silt would shift under 100 marching feet, where the cutbank would slough, where a raft might twist and spill men like beads. "They are still 2 days' march from the Twins," Brynden went on. "Roose Bolton holds at Harrenhal's ashes, but Tywin has no stomach to feed a host in the ruins he made himself. If he tries the Green Fork, the Freys will bleed him if they think it pleases us, and stand aside if they sniff a better-cooked joint. Better for him to try us here." He folded the map. "Better for us, that is. Better if we say nothing and let him think us tangled until he is halfway, and then—" Edmure's hand closed in the air. "Until the door shuts," Brynden said. A thin rain began, the kind that could be mistaken for mist, and yet found its way under wool and into joints. It softened the edges of everything. dulled the river's glint and the feathering light along the curve of Riverrun's towers. Behind them a bell sounded, not so much a clang as a deep-throated pulse. Once, twice, to mark the hour. In the yard below, men drew bowls of oat porridge and salted beef. A potboy who had once chased Edmure with a frog clutched his ladle as if it were a sword. The Lord of Riverrun watched him, and felt all his life gather into a point between his ribs. "Send word to Mallister," he said. "Seaguard knows the sea. Let him watch the river's mouth. If Tywin tries to float a surprise along the coast, I want Lord Jason's gulls to peck it raw." "Bah! Already flown," Brynden said, amused. "Of course it is," Edmure admitted. "You always were an impatient owl." That won him the brief half-grin that lived under the blackfish's mustache like a shy fish under a rock. "See that you keep your patience, nephew," Brynden said. "Men will clamor. Men will call you craven before noon and savior by dusk. It's wind. Let them call what they will," Edmure said, and wanted to believe himself. "I will do as my king commands." Brynden's hand was on his shoulder for a moment, heavy and warm through the wet wool. "Good. Then come. Let us go walk our door." They rode out by the east gate with a handful of guards wearing the tully leaping trout above cuirasses darkened by the weather. The rain laid a thin coat of shine on mail, a sheen Edmure had always loved. It made his men look like water had risen through them. The road ran under drooping elms and past the blackened ruin of a farmer's cottage that had fallen before one of Gregor Clegane's forays in the season before. Edmure had helped bury the char-scorched bones that had been found in the pigsty. Their memory went with him like a stone in his boot. At the stone mill, the tumblestone narrowed and hissed like an angry cat. The mill had stood there since the days of the old king, rebuilt a dozen times and stubborn as a trout. Now its wheel turned slow and creaked like an old man's knees. Downriver, the miller's wife and her two daughters watched the river and their new overlord with guarded eyes. They had the neat, narrowed look of women who had learned to live with little and keep it hidden. Edmure dismounted and walked to the stone apron, felt the rivers pull through the soles of his boots, and nodded to the men along the banks, who wore the drab of peasantry and the eyes of soldiers. "Your dam?" he said to the miller's widow. "May be washed tonight, mistress. Better the wood goes to the flood than your daughters to Lannister boots." "We know that, my lord," she said, and there was resignation in it, but no accusation. "We pulled our sacks to the loft and I hid the bread starter in the baker's house. You do as you must. We'll have a wheel again when trout are fat. Then, pal, I will see you paid out," Edmure said, and she nodded. Not as if she believed him, but as if she believed such words needed saying, and so she allowed him the comfort of saying them. He thought of his father and felt a sharp ache in his throat. The blackfish crouched at the end of the apron and prodded the mortar with a dagger tip. "Soft," he said to no one in particular. The men on the far bank were busy along the reeds. Edmure watched them lag bolts of thick rope in the mud. The rope was tarred with pine pitch, black and reeking. It would sink black and sly where no man would expect it, and then it would hold hooks like teeth. "Is the stake line set?" Brynden asked. "Aye," said Sir Desmond Grell, appearing with water dripping off the tail of his mustache. Riverrun's master-at-arms had a weathered face like a cliff and patient hands. He gestured with 2 fingers, and a man rose from the reeds to show them a length of ash pole. Hard, fire-cured, with its lower end whittled to a cruel point, crooked as a crone's finger under the water. Any horse that tries it learns why women curse in childbed. "Dansh." Edmure breathed in river and tar and wet leather and felt a steadying. Strategy ceased to be a diagram and became ropes and hands. He walked the bank with them, his boots taking silt and the rain ticking on his shoulders. He took the small knife a boy offered and knelt and cut reed, and felt the clean pull of flax cords on his palm. Men looked up when he came near. He gave them nods and small words, not because he believed his small words were witchery, but because he had learned men liked to be seen by the man who sent them to crouch in mud. "Duty," he told himself again, and the word no longer tasted entirely like grief. When they returned to Riverrun, the castle had changed. Rain gave men a particular stillness. It drew them inward like snails. Yet beneath that quiet, The air was strung tight. Mark Piper's men had come in and were laughing too loud, casting bones and patting their mounts with an affection that was nearly apology for restraining them. Carol Vance leaned over a table with Titos Blackwood and his son Brynden Blackwood, their heads bent as if they muttered over a board of Sivas. Utherides Wayne hovered like a careful ghost with an armful of warrants. From the tower where Hoster Tully lay, there came no sound. It was as if the cough that had once rung like distant hammering had been swallowed by the rain. Edmure ate in the smaller hall, because the great hall felt like a stage when he did not have a speech to give. The stew was barley and onion and a scrap of salt pork. He ate all of it, and pushed away the trencher of bread because his body hummed with river and rope, and had no room for more. Men drifted in and drifted out. News drifted with them. Red cloaks seen at Lord Perrin's ferries. A band of freeriders raiding for plow oxen near River Run's Westfields. A Lannister banner glimpsed through willow below the mill, then gone. He kept his hands flat on the table and listened, and did not rise. When night fell, it fell abruptly, as if the clouds had lengthened it with their thumbs all day, and then let go. Torches guttered along the walls, and a ripple of light ran along the water. He walked alone to the Godswood, because men watched him, and he had need of a place where trees did not expect words. The Godswood of River Run had no weirwood. The old white tree had died before his grandfather's time, and the sept had been raised by Hoster's father to please his wife. But there were oaks and alders, and a black hawthorn that filled the air with sweetness in spring, and the pool held a darkness that reflected torches and erased them. He stood before it, and did not pray, because he did not know any words that felt as real as ropes and stakes in water. Instead he said Rob's letter to himself in the silence, line by line, until the quiet pulled the words down into it, and what remained was only the rivers beating on his body like rain. "The boy will come to you," Brynden had told him earlier, when they had paused under a drooping alder and watched the rope sink. "He wants to be measured. If he finds gentleness in you when he is braced for an axe, you will unman him. So be the axe and the shoulder both." "What boy?" Edmure had asked, and the Blackfish had only given him a look, that half grin turned melancholy, as if he saw not just men and rivers, but time. They woke before dawn to horns in the west field. The sound came thin at first, then layered as more voices joined. A woven call that shook sleep from men like dogs shaking rain. Edmure was in mail before the second horn finished its breath. He followed Brynden up through the spiraling stair and into the pale smear of morning. Far west, where the river ran to the stone teeth of the mill, the fog lifted itself by rags and bushes to show a dark flocking of shapes. The vanguard had come in silence and workmanlike as carpenters. Their horsemen were little knots of movement along the bank, and the first of the cavalry were already in the water where the shallows braided into bars. The river's skin dimpled and then tore around their knees. More came behind, regimented, their banners furled and tied hard against the wind to avoid advertising themselves. They moved like a thing taught to move, segments of a worm that had learned to mimic intelligence. A murmur ran along the walls of River Run. Men leaned and breathed in. Edmure lifted a hand, the smallest gesture, and felt the murmur cease, not because his hand had magic, but because men wanted permission to hold their tongues. "Wait," he said, though he knew his order would carry whether he spoke it or not. The signalmen had their flags tucked under their arms and their lamps hooded for daylight. The boys at the horn muzzles had cheeks drawn tight to keep from using their breath too soon. In the reeds left of the mill, a heron rose. It flapped a long, ragged wing, considered the river and the men in it. And then, as if it had no patience for any of it, it turned and went. The first Lannister horses found depth where they had expected firmness. Grooms had walked the shallows yesterday, but rivers do not swear oath to yesterday. A gelding screamed. The sound carried thin and high like a flute until the water took it. Men went in after, because men did that, and then men hesitated, because men did that too when they saw horses drown like children. Tywin Lannister did not ride the ford himself. He would be half a day behind in a pavilion crisp as pastry and dry. In the van was Lord Lefford with his square jaw and careful eyes, and with him Adam Marbrand, whose hair had a gold like torchlight when the day was clean, though now the sky made it muddy. Edmure saw Marbrand by the way he moved. A coolness in the seat, a way of leaning forward slightly as if listening to his mount. He felt a small twist in himself. Admiration is not always treason. And then he put it away too. Men. Flags. Ropes. The miller's dam surrendered as if it had been waiting all its life for permission. The water that had had its throat squeezed all yesterday and all last night took one breath and then burst. It was not a roar so much as a lifting, a swell that came smooth and implacable. It met the men in the shallows as a gentle catastrophe. No break, no white mane, nothing dramatic, only depth sliding up thighs and hips, and then suddenly bellies, and all the arithmetic of men and horses went wrong. "Now," Brynden said, voice calm as if ordering oatcakes. Light flicked along the bank as lamps were unhooded, and the signal flags went up like birds startled from a barley field. The horn boys blew their wake up to the river. The sound walked in long steps. The men in the reeds hauled on ropes, and the tarred lines came taut under the water. Dark, blind, and deadly. Men who had been stepping sideways with caution suddenly found their feet yanked from under them by teeth they could not see. Stakes bit. A horse went over, a knight with him. Iron groaned, and then the river made a gulp that echoed along the banks as men tried to breathe where water did not permit. Arrows began, not a sheet, but a measured rain. They came from both banks, for Edmure had learned at last that a river is a thing full of mirrors, and men's eyes are always drawn to brightness. So he had set his brightest there, and his most patient where the fog still held. The first volleys drove the foremost back, not because they feared, but because they had lost their feet and had no purchase. Behind, still ashore, men pressed forward because men do not like to be pushed by their own breath and their own weight, and so for a time, the van was a press, not a column. Then the ropes did their second work. Grapnels climbed underwater like crabs. Boys with their arms around half-submerged stones hauled, and tarred lines slid through slick hands and bit skin. They had spent half a night rubbing ash into their calluses for this moment. When the poles went up, varnished ash capped with iron, they came up under rafts and under men, turned them, and the river took them sideways like a clever partner in a dance, to places where the weight of water would make the choice for them. No horns from River Run signaled a sally. No gate opened. The trout did not leap. It waited under the bank with its white mouth slightly ajar, the way riverfish do when they fancy themselves invisible. When Lefford's trumpets blew, there was valiance in them. And when Lannister men stood their ground in the middle water, it was not without courage, but it was like watching men decide the wind would not blow in their faces if they squared their shoulders. "Hold," Edmure said to himself. And then, because he had learned that saying aloud made the words inhabit the day, he said it again more softly, and felt his jaw ache where the word touched the bone. He could see Mark Piper twitching at his elbow like a dog seeing rabbits. The Piper boy bit the inside of his cheek and muscled his bright, restless energy into something like obedience. The press eased when the van accepted the river's refusal and drew back. Men on the near bank looked at each other with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. No one likes to stand still and be clever. Edmure let them have that moment. Then second horns sounded upstream, where the red fork split and braided into lesser paths, and there the Lannister foot came on slower and more methodically, with bundles of faggots and planks and poles, the materials of bridges borne on the shoulders of sweating men. The Lannisters had learned, as they always did, they would not put all their hope on any one ford, not when they had 1,000 to test. Brynden touched Edmure's elbow. "Let them build," he murmured. "Only until the middle span," Edmure murmured back. "Only so," Brynden agreed. At the little ford called Harrow's Crossing, named for a farmer's wife who had drowned there and whose ghost boys said braided cattails into girls' hair, the Lannister foot waded with poles and built a bridge cunningly angled against the flow. They were good hands, men who had had calluses before they had had swords. They laughed when the river lapped at their knees, and the laughter made them less frightening but no less dangerous. Edmure watched them with a quiet respect. He signaled, by a small motion of 2 fingers, and men along the bank eased close to ropes sunk there. They let the bridge grow like a vine, plank by plank, until it reached the place where the water turned sly and the riverbed pretended to meet the bank and then did not. There the men who had been laughing found themselves standing on something like the memory of earth. "Now," Brynden said again, with the tone of a man telling a horse what it already knows. The rope went tight with a humming that Edmure felt as much as heard, and then a thing like a great jaw closed underwater. The bridge did not break in a theatrical spray. It tipped sullenly, like a stubborn animal, and then slid sideways. Men flailed, poles pinwheeled. A plank shot free like a fish. Arrows came again, precise and ungenerous. A man trying to haul a friend out found a hook in his own thigh, and let go not because he lacked love, but because pain is more persuasive than loyalty when a river is explaining itself. They tried again and again, as men do. At the mill, at Harrow's Crossing, at Old Bear's Ford where the current grumbled in its sleep, at 5 Stones where children had tied red rags to a hawthorn and called it a wish tree. Each place had been watched and measured and prepared with a patient malice that Edmure would not have believed himself capable of a year ago. The Lannisters were wealth and will. The rivers were stubbornness and memory. Between the two, men threshed. By noon, word came like birds lit from tree to tree on the tongues of outriders. Tywin's van had failed to force the tumblestone. A second column had turned east, pacing the Red Fork, hunting shallows as a hound hunts scent. Men in red and gold had been seen at Maidenpool's crossroads. A third body of men had set fire to Hyrix above Pink Maiden in temper and retreat. Sir Gregor's company, heavier iron and uglier eyes, had ridden toward the river villages as if they might ransom water by terror. Edmure listened, and the map in his head shifted. Trapping a host was not a theatrical net. It was a patience of doors that closed one after the other, until a man looked up and found himself in a room without windows. "Send word to Lord Vance to Harry without revealing his teeth," he said. "Bruise the supply wagons. Bash a wheel here, a wheel there. Leave half a cask of salt with the bung out on the rutted road, and let them think their men drunked it. Give them arguments with each other instead of with us." Carol Vance grunted approval. "I have men who can do this with their eyes half shut." "Let Blackwood hold the river above 5 Stones," Edmure continued. "Tell him he has leave to use the ravens." The Blackwoods liked to pretend their birds were spies. Men laughed, but men also turned their faces up when feather shadows slid. What mattered was not whether the birds spoke sense, but that men believed the trees were watching them. "And in the west?" Brynden asked. "In the west we do nothing that looks glorious," Edmure said, feeling the knot in him tighten and unsettle. "We leave our gates closed and our arrows made up and our ropes tarred dark. We watch tire and hunger and misgiving, stand on Tywin's shoulders and crow in his ear. Then They had no way to see Tywin Lannister when the Lion Lord at last reined his horse beneath the shade of a twisted willow and watched his van splash back from the ford like bitter children. Had they seen him, they would have seen not rage but something quieter. A small dismissal with one nostril, a tightening at the corner of the mouth. A man like Tywin had learned to ignore the weather of his blood. The only storms he admitted were the ones he set. He listened to Lefford, to Adam Marbrand, to Kevan Lannister. Solid, patient Kevan, who would say sense even when sense pinched, and he made marks on his map with a quill that had not trembled in his hand since he was 15. He had told his men that the Riverlands were a table on which he would eat. Now the table's legs had been sawn to questionable lengths. "If they wish to play at fishermen," he said almost idly, "we will show them what it is to bail." "Our foragers are being harrowed," Adam said. "Some peasant witch has taught them to hide bread in holes. They leave the fields luscious and the barns empty. Prudent bastards." "Thou." "Break their holes," Tywin said. "Do it without fires where men may see the smoke and say we have lost our temper. If you must burn, burn in a place where the wind will carry the smoke to those we wish to move. Send Sir Gregor east to dissuade the small folk from feeling brave, but chain a dog to his ankle and pull him back when he has made his point. We waste ourselves when we glut." He lifted his cup and sipped water. Not wine. He drank water when there was a long fight to be done. It was a lesson he had learned, because he had liked wine too well when he was 20. "If they will not allow us the tumblestone," Kevin said, "we must lean heavier on the Red Fork. There is a ford at Cobble Ridge. Their dispositions at River Run show a vanity about that mill." "And beware vanity in us," Tywin said, almost lazily. It was his way of praising without rancor. "Very well. We go to Cobble Ridge." He did not say they would try other doors too, because a man like Tywin did not narrate his patience. He only exercised it like a muscle, and expected the world to feel it. Edmure did not know any of this, but he felt it as men feel weather. He ate salt beef standing, swallowed it without tasting, drank small beer that tasted of smoke and river herbs, and went again to the walls. The rain had thinned, but the sky wore thin pewter. He found old Sir Desmond instructing boys on the angle at which to hold a pike, when a horse's eye was the highest part of it. He found Utherides Wain carefully counting crossbow quarrels, as if their iron points were grain seeds. He found Mark Piper on the east tower with his lips pressed so tight together they made a pale seam. The boy bowed, an awkwardness in him, and did not make the joke that had been twitching at his tongue. "I will not be the reason the door swings too early," Mark said abruptly, astonishing himself as much as Edmure. "Your father will think I have transformed you into a Grey sister," Edmure said dryly. "Day's not done," Mark answered, and it was as close to an oath of patience as he could manage. By dusk, Tywin's men were trying Cobble Ridge and being educated by a different arrangement of sandbars and stakes. By midnight, a company had tried to float barrels filled with brush to make a causeway, and Bryndon's men had slipped the ropes and turned the barrels into drums that floated downstream to bump at the mill's apron like foolish beasts. There were fewer horns at night. Men spoke more in the way of riverfolk, with whistles and owl calls and small knocks on wood. The light from rivermen's lamps painted slow gold ladders on the black water. A moth butted one, went daft with love of the light, and then disappeared. At some hour that might have been named for a saint if River Run had had a septon sober enough to keep such books. Catelyn Stark walked the inner yard with her cloak pulled over her hair. Edmure saw her from the parapet as one sees a figure in a play through a window. He did not call down to her. He knew her face and the set of her shoulders when she carried more than she had words for. He knew that she would not waste him with a plea that he do what he was already doing. She moved like a woman trying to keep pace with news that was a day away. He watched her lift a hand briefly to the tower where her father slept or did not sleep. A kernel of warmth went through him, more painful than any river cold. He put it away too. Near dawn, a shout rose from the north bank that had not the shape of alarm, but of discovery. Edmure and Bryndon were on the move before the echo had reached the next tower. They found it at 5 stones. The Lannisters had forced a crossing with a narrow bridge half hidden under the humped backs of barrels and bale-wrapped bundles, and a file of foot had made it over while the river was blinking cool at its own cleverness. The first 4 men stood on the near bank, wet as seals, and lifted their spears and cheered. A small, honest sound that would have been boyish if not for the knives at their belts. "Let them come," Edmure said, the word pulling up out of him through fear and eagerness like a fish taking a fly. He signaled. Men eased back from shadowed hedgerow, and from behind the squat shapes of haystacks, wrapped in thatch. The Lannister men on the near bank saw no movement, and seeing none, called more over, as men do who believe fortune has opened her shirt a little for them. He watched them sink stakes on their side to secure the bridge in a hurry and thought, "Good, good, good." He was thinking like a river again. He wanted the middle to hold for 1 more minute. Then he looked across and saw the men on the far bank hauling more and more men into the crossing, eager to increase numbers before they met steel. He looked down the long curve of the Red Fork and saw its skin change, a thickening like a thought. In the reeds, a boy with a horn looked up at him and waited, as if waiting for a game's cue. "Now," Edmure said, and the boy blew. The men in the reeds took the tarred rope they had been nursing in their palms for what felt like all their lives, and they hauled. Hooks bit the barrel bridge under water where hemp turned mean and sharp. The bridge shuddered like a horse feeling flies, then listed, then gave up. The men on it flailed in silence because river water steals your voice first. The men on the near bank, 24 now, wet, grinning, brave, suddenly alone, looked at each other with an expression that any man might pity in an enemy. They lifted their spears as if the steel would explain something water had left unsaid. Edmure raised a hand and dropped it. Arrows came in a careful pattern, nicking, persuading, not savaging, because he did not care to spill gore into the water that would feed his folk downstream. The Lannister men shifted and edged back, only to find that the bank had grown steep while they stared at their comrades drowning. Bryndon's men had carved it in the night, cut into damp clay quietly, and packed the leavings down with their feet in river stones, so that it would hold just long enough to let overconfidence climb it, just long enough to make retreat awkward and slick. "Take them," Bryndon said. Men rose like weeds from hedgerow and from the shadows of the 5 old glacial stones that gave the fort its name. It was not a glorious charge. It was a closing of fingers. It was the end of a patience. The Lannister men did their best, because men nearly always do, and a riverman in a patched jerkin took a spear in the side and sat down astonished and bled out among cattails. Another laughed as he drove a hook through a calf and then put a hand to his mouth as if ashamed of the sound. Edmure watched until the last of the little fight had gone out of it, and then he sent Bryndon forward with a hand and walked away because he knew when his presence would only make the men want to strain at the leash he had just shortened. He stood on the crest of the bank under a hawthorn and breathed river and blood and tar. The sky in the east had learned a pink that did not belong to rain. He thought of Tywin's quill making small dismissals on maps and of Gregor Clegan's wide shoulders cutting into doorways, and of boys hauling at ropes until their hands bled and laughed, and then looked down at their palms, surprised at the price. He thought of Robb's letter and of the boy who had signed it king in the north, and he felt for a moment that was almost tender. His entire life take root in the riverlands like a willow cutting thrust into bank mud. Behind him, Bryndon came with a prisoner. A boy in studded leather with hair plastered to his skull and teeth that did not meet quite right. He wore no sigil, a bootlicker's cuirass. He stared with eyes that made Edmure think of trout flopping on a bank, full of stubborn life, and not understanding that the air would not help it. Bryndon pushed him to his knees, not unkindly. "Name," Bryndon said. "Tom," the boy said. And then, because that answer had never pleased anyone in his life, "Tom on the Rills." "I drove pigs afore." "Tom," Edmure said, tasting the shape of the name, "you will go back to your lord with words I put in your mouth. You will say, 'The river will take what it is given and give nothing back.' You will say, 'Turn east if you like, the green fork wears the same face.' You will say, 'Any road you take, the door is behind you and it is closing.'" The boy looked up at him with that fish look. He had no way to measure what he had become part of. Pigs do not talk politics. He nodded because men nod when a lord speaks. Bryndon took him away to wash the mud off his face and find him clothes that would get him into a Lannister camp without being flayed. Edmure stared at the river until it blurred and then sharpened again. All that day and into the next, the dance went on. Tywin's men grew more careful, and careful men are always harder prey when the trap relies on their pride. But hunger and affront and orders, made with a pen in a dry pavilion, pulled at them, and the river, having learned their measure, took them in ways that did not flatter. They carved steps into banks and the steps slid. They made rafts and the rafts developed their own opinions. They found a sweet little ford at Cooper's Run, and then discovered that the gravel gave way like deceit. The ropes were everywhere and nowhere. The arrows were not wasted. Men learned that to step high with knees up like a horse was wiser than marching. And then they learned that to step high was to expose yourself to the patient watching of any boy with a Fletcher's pride. At River Run, the kitchens turned bone into broth and boys into runners. The smithy sang. The ravens came and went with black silk folding and unfolding in the wet air. Edmure slept in naps with his boots on, and found himself waking already halfway to the next task. He missed his father with the sudden rawness of a man who realizes his quarrels have grown nostalgic. He drank water because his uncle had pressed it into his hand, and when he laughed once at a small jest from Utherides Wayne about counting quarrels like counting prayers, he surprised himself and stood for a moment feeling the echo of it in his ribs as if it were foreign. In Tywin's pavilion, wine remained on its shelf. Kevin advised patience. Marbrand advised audacity that pretended to be a mistake. Lefford advised hammers in place of knives. Tywin listened to them all and did not show his approval, except in the subtle drift of the map weights. He sent Gregor to make statements and then chained him back again with orders like iron in velvet. He shifted his host, not as a mass but as a set of conversations. Here a threat, there a promise, here a rumor. When a rumor reached Riverrun, that the Lion would turn east and run the Blackwater down to the sea. Edmure got no exultation from it. He had learned to distrust both good news and bad. "Lord," one of the baggy-eyed boys from the Horns said at dusk. "The men are asking for a name for today." Edmure looked at him, baffled. "For a day? They like to call days names," the boy said, flushing. "Like the day they took the mill from Lord Perrin. They call it the Grinder." A stupid affection touched Edmure then. He looked out at ropes coiled wet and smelling of pine, at boys with raw palms, and men with mud dried in their beard and eyes that were bright with the shine of work done well. He thought of the way the river had swallowed, and returned and refused and accepted. A civilized serpent that would not be tamed, but could be courted. "Call it the Day of the Door," he said finally, knowing it was vanity and not caring. "Call it that so men remember the closing of it." They cheered him softly, not so loud that sound would travel to ears he did not want to inform, and went to their meat and their beer, the way men go to bed after plowing, with a tiredness that is its own good. That night, the rain ceased. The sky thinned, and the first ragged stars came down to the river, and made a ladder there. Edmure stood alone where the hawthorn grew, and took in the smell the rain had left behind, the rich wet iron reek and the crushed sedge sweetness. He felt, for the first time in weeks, not a knot in his chest, but a long muscle uncoiling, slow as the river itself. Tywin Lannister was not a man to starve and call it virtue. He would find a road men could not see, or he would make one with coin and iron. Robb would be wherever wolves learned to be men, and men learned to be wolves. Catelyn would carry words between gods and flesh until her voice shredded. The phrase would count and count again. The Riverlands would take the weight of all of them and turn it into water, because that is what it did. But for this night, under a sky that looked as if someone had combed their fingers through the clouds and left them in soft lines, Edmure Tully allowed himself one clean breath. The Lion had put his paw into the shallows and found teeth, and the door, which no man could see with his eyes, had moved another finger's width toward shut. "Yeah. Ha." By morning the ropes smelled of pine sap and riverweed and men's hands, and the banks wore the signs of work like scabs. The boys from the villages had learned to keep their palms open when the line took weight and to lean with their hips, not their shoulders. They had learned to let a rope slide like a live thing, not to choke it. Old Desmond Grell moved among them with his staff and his quiet stonecutter's voice, tapping a wrist here, a shoulder there, correcting angles the way a mason corrects a wall before it leans. Edmure watched and did not interfere. It was a discipline to stand and be the weight that held the web taut while others tugged. The Lannisters came early, as if they had decided that morning light would favor their gold. A haze lay on the red fork that turned it pewter. The banners on the far bank showed as smudges until the breeze lifted and made them snap into lions again. At Cobble Ridge the first men waded with brush bundles on their backs like humped tortoises, passing them forward hand to hand to lay a path across treacherous ground. The river took 3 and gave back 1. The other 2 would lodge somewhere downstream against willow roots and turn sullen with rot. They did not stop. Men rarely do when they have begun, and pride has a way of finding work for hands, even when water argues against it. "Let them take the middle," Brynden said beside Edmure, low enough that the words did not carry. "Let the weight find the lie." "The east edge is soft," Edmure murmured. "They will think they have it, and then feel it sigh." "You have learned the river," Brynden said, and the pride in his voice was no brighter than old iron, which made it warmer. They waited. The bridge grew from a guess into a spine. The first files came with shields up, heads down, the way men go under sleet. Mark Piper paced as if counting to a number that kept receding. When the span had a sound to it, an ugly creak like a tooth being worried. Edmure lifted a hand, as languid as a trout flicking a fin. Men along both banks eased ropes through their hands. Hooks found hemp guts below and pulled. The bridge the Lannisters had sweated into existence slid 3 feet and stuck, and then the river made up its mind for them. Their careful line became a ragged cloth, and men in it were knots pulling at the wrong places. Edmure watched until the panic reached that pitch where words became useless, and then he nodded to the horn boys. The notes that went out were not jubilant. They were work signals. The river had accepted payment. Now it was time to lift the rest. By midday, the banks were a lesson writ into mud and bent reeds. The lion banners had eased back in places and pushed in others. A distant bright flicker marked Adam Marbrand's riders testing the tumbling water west of the mill. A darker smear downstream meant Gregor Clegane's men. Heavier, less clever, the sort of soldiers who unclog a thing by hitting it until it moves. There were plumes of smoke where villagers had been instructed to light wet brush at the first sign of red cloaks, to make a lie of fires and bring men on to nothing. The lie worked twice and then lost its savor, but twice was enough to put scowls under gilt helmets. Utherides Wayne stood in a dry patch beneath the parapet and counted quarrels again, lips moving. "We have enough to waste none," he reported when Edmure passed, as if repeating it would conjure more. "If I see a man throw a shot in pride, I'll count it in his supper." "Give him 2, Edmure said. "One for hunger and one for shame." Wayne's mouth made a small shape that might have been a smile. "Very good, my lord." Tito's Blackwood came at noon with his son and their ravens. They brought news as if the birds' black backs had shone with it. A Lannister foraging column broken at the Sweet Spring by Carol Vance's men who knew the country from milking days. A half-dozen supply wagons turned in a ditch chest deep with last week's rains. A hostler's boy in Lannister colors found asleep in a hayrick with a stolen loaf in his shirt and tears clean on his dirty face. Blackwood's own face was a dry landscape. His eyes stayed as steady on Edmure as they had when he had watched Hoster Tully laugh and drink. The boy, young Brynden Blackwood, looked from his father to Edmure like a raven measuring the distance from branch to branch. "My lord," Tito said, after salutes were done and courtesies paid with the careful coins men use when the day is made of iron. "I am holding the upper fords at 5 Stones and Greygate with 10 score archers and 3 score billmen. They have a taste for barrel bridges now. They brought a carpenter along with a long face and a pack of nails like a dowry. He does not relish this work." "Few carpenters love building to drown their brothers," Edmure said. "Hold them kindly if you can and cruelly if you must. Make your men drink water and not boast." "We drink from the same river," Blackwood said quietly. "I have taught my son that much. He is young enough not to know that men ruin what feeds them." "You're young enough to pretend they want," Edmure said to the boy, and Brynden Blackwood held his eyes for a breath and then dropped them, cheeks warming. There was something in that reminded Edmure of himself at 15, held at his father's shoulder with words like oars and no idea where to put them in. Catelyn Stark found Edmure in the shade of the South Tower when the sun finally bullied the clouds into rags. Her cloak was brown wool pulled close. Her hair had escaped the confines of its pins and lay in a damp rope over one shoulder. There was no water in her face. Catelyn looked like hills and stone, and Edmure had always felt both safer and smaller around her. "How long?" she asked. Not as a test and not as a plea, only as a sister who trusted him to give a real answer. "As long as it takes for a lion to get hungry," he said. "The river will not move for pride. It will move for weather. It will move for time. We can lend it our hands and our rope and the shape of our patience. Beyond that, we must be watchmen." "Oh." She drew in a breath that sounded like someone remembering how to breathe. "And then they will do something ugly," he said. "Tywin is not a man to sit in the rain and admire our knots. He will feint east and push west and buy a man to sell us a step. And when he pays for a road and gets none, he will decide to make one of bone and iron. When he does, we have to decide whether to let him, a little, so the road brings him further into the country we hold, or whether to bloody him and drive him into the arms of the king he serves." Benderwanarwanda. Her mouth tightened at king, the word a bruise. "Joffrey." "That boy," Edmure said, tasting contempt and swallowing it, because contempt is a great eater of sense. But he is a signpost only. Behind him are men, and behind men is gold. Not always, Catelyn said, and he knew she was thinking of Robb with no gold but the coin of grief. They stood together for a time as if the shade itself were holding them. Raised voices came faintly from the north battlements. Mark Piper disputing with a Piper man over the proper fletch for a wet day. Utherides Wayne's counting slid out and back like a prayer. In the tower above them, Hoster Tully lay and slept or labored at not breathing. The river talked to itself in a tone that had once put Edmure to sleep when thunder had frightened him at 6. "News from the south?" he asked finally. "A raven from Darry. Lord Harroway's town is full of whispers." She glanced up at him through the ropes of her hair. "The Tyrells are on the march again, though to where and to whom they mean to ally themselves is a matter of wine and tongues." Littlefinger vanished like a coin palmed by a juggler. "Some say he rode west. Some say he rode west. Some say he rode out of a man's tent, and the man found a sack of golden roses where his purse had been." "As long as no one says he walked on water," Edmure said, "I'll suffer all the other marvels." She smiled despite herself, and then let it fall. "There are other stories. Stannis has taken Storm's End. Stannis has taken Dragonstone. Stannis has set fire to the sea. Stannis has been seen walking with a shadow that does not belong to him." Edmure looked at the river and saw in it for a moment a road leading all the way to the sea, and thence to a city he had never loved save for what it had taken from his sister. "I have always found that men's shadows belong to the sun and not to kings," he said. "But I will believe whatever the ravens bring when the ravens bring it. Until then, I will believe in ropes and posts and tar." She touched his sleeve. "Do that then. Do exactly that. I never thought I would be the one to tell you to do what our father would have told you to do. I did not think I would be the man who could," he said. And it was not apology and not boast, merely an accounting. The next day, the Lannisters tested the Tumblestone with something like grace. They had learned positions where the river's anger was disguised as a lullaby, and they brought boats down on wagons, light canvas things stretched over willow ribs, river skins, the sort of craft smugglers used on the Green Fork to carry a man and a pack of contraband at night. Edmure felt in his bones the cleverness of it. He felt the slight lift of admiration men have for competence, even in an enemy. He nodded to the Blackfish, who took a dozen men and slipped away with the quiet of an otter. They came back at dusk, smelling of eel and mud and triumph. "They had their boats," Brynden said. "And now their boats have ours. A boy might have thought we needed such toys. We do not. We will use them anyway." He tossed an object at Edmure's boots. Edmure stooped and picked up a bit of willow hoop bound in gut that had been cut clean. "Hooks and a certain idea applied underwater, and men will believe themselves hexed. A good thing, belief. Saves us quarrels. Damnaman." At Harrow's crossing a Lannister captain pushed 100 men through knee-deep water at a place that had been sound the day before, and then turned treacherous because a group of rivermen had hauled stones downriver in the night and sown them like grain to redirect the flow. The water climbed their thighs and then their bellies, and a murmur went through the file like fear through cattle. They did not break. Edmure fed them 3 arrows, then 4, then silence. The silence did more. One man turned his head fractionally. Now the current had his hip. Men saw the man turn his head and felt the current resist him, and knew that the river was a lord, and would not be flattered into mercy. The file eased backward, muddy, sullen, and more dangerous for the lesson. Edmure left them that danger. Sometimes a man you have frightened is a man you may move again in a predictable path. Ravens brought parcels of rumor, as if rumor were bread. Lord Jason Mallister sent word that a pair of Lannister cogs had been seen feeling the coast near Seaguard like pickpockets easing through a purse. He had sent his gulls, light boats full of light men, to nip at them and send them off sulking. A hedge knight in Darry colors, captured near the fair market, while trying to purchase 30 shoes with a single silver stag and a bad conscience, confessed under the threat of losing 2 fingers that Tywin had sent riders parleying with a phrase for a crossing. The Freys had wanted coin for tolls and marriages for pride, and had found themselves weighed and priced, and found both dear. "They may be dear," Brynden said when Edmure read that line to him, "but they are not priceless." "Lord Walder will sniff the wind twice and then sell it if he can," Edmure said. "If the lion pays him a smell, he will put on a lion's tail. If the wolf pays him a growl, he will carry a tuft of fur. If both look away, he will pretend to be a sheep and bleat." "I have loved you more since you learned to be unkind," Brynden observed dryly. "What I feel is not unkindness," Edmure said, surprised at his own heat. "It is a love that has learned it must choose where to spend itself. The river chose too. 3 days into the testing and tugging, there came a rain that began like a courtesy and turned into a labor. It fell with patience, thickening the soil underfoot, putting a muted sheen on every surface and waiting banners until lions sagged like tired cats. It swelled the Red Fork first. The Tumblestone caught the news and brought it down in her own time, full of hurrying clarity. The bridges that had begun to be possible turned surly. Men lost their footing where no one would have lost it yesterday. Wagons labored and fell still, and a wheel mired to its hub in a place where yesterday a wheel had signed its name and passed on. Now, if he will not starve, he must flare, Brynden said, standing with his cloak's hood thrown back so the rain could stitch little wet threads into his hair. Or he must turn south and try the fords near Lord Harroway's town, where the ground is broader and flatter and the river is less vain. If he turns south, he lengthens his road by a week. If he flares, he makes a mistake. Nan? He is a man accustomed to men lengthening roads for him, Edmure said. And men accustomed to that make mistakes when the road grows teeth, Brynden said. Let us give him teeth. They gave them at Eelbund. The place had earned its name from the way the river curved back on itself slyly there, making a long, slow question out of moving water. Alders leaned above it with roots like hands. Edmure had loved the place since boyhood because trout lay in the shadow where the current turned and rested in the cool after a long run. He had learned to cast there. He had learned to kneel on the bank and think of nothing but the feel of line on his fingers. That memory ran under this plan like a low music. They left Eelbund looking neglected. A deception has to be ugly to be beautiful. The banks showed boot marks, but too many. The sort that say this is a place where boys come to piss and men to talk. Not a place where soldiers wait. The ropes that lay under the water were not tarred. They were treated with a mixture of ash and fish oil that made them smell like the river itself. A length of willow, cut at the right angle, lay with its leaves still on to suggest that men had been careless here, not cunning. On the far bank, a notched tree bore a mark that said nothing to Lannister eyes, and a great deal to a riverman. When you see this, cut here and let the tree fall when the rope tells you. They let 100 across. No more. It took longer than pride likes. Rain made men clumsy and careful by turns. They came with shields up and heads lowered, not because arrows fell but because habit told them to be small when the air was busy. They took the far bank by inches and steadied as if surprised to find earth. 50 more crossed before the river, which had been giving them a lesson while pretending it was a gift, grew tired. The bridge swayed. A man staggered and righted. Another smiled stupidly to find his foot on a place that he had expected to be absence and stillness. That was the moment when the hookmen on both banks heaved. The rope bit with a dull song, and the bridge turned its hip to the current, like a dancer, and then went from being a thing to being planks. The men on it were suddenly not crossing, but swimming with all the wrong clothes. On the far bank, the 150 who had made it bristled like a little boar finding itself in a wolf pack. They had put down stakes for a causeway. The stakes held long enough to keep them from backing easily, which was the point. Edmure lifted a hand, and the men who had been cutting the marked willow leaned on their saws, as if all their fathers had been woodcutters. The tree went with a long complaint, hesitated as if remembering the direction of its loyalty, and then fell into the river with a sound like a man taking a heavy breath. Upstream a second tree went, and a third, and they lodged where previous quiet work had encouraged them to lodge. The current's mind changed. Now the 150 on the near bank found themselves on a narrow strip between sudden depth and sudden shallows. Brynden lifted a hand and the men came out of Hyrix and the hedgerow and the shadow of the alder roots, where they had been lying with water dripping off their noses. It was not a charge so much as a closing of a box. The Lannisters made a knot of shields and tried to chew their way through the side that looked weakest. The side did not yield because stakes had been placed there for men to brace their feet against. The first to go down was a man in good iron with braid at his cuffs. The second was a boy with a bit of red cloth bound stupidly about his arm to make himself braver. Edmure watched. He had promised himself he would, and that he would know the shape of the work he chose. "Take prisoners where you can," he said, and Brynden repeated it in a tone that gave the words weight. The men complied where he'd allowed them. A man who has nearly drowned will flail and cut himself on your hook if you reach too soon. You have to let him take a breath first. The lesson applied on land too. They took 24 alive, among them a Craighall man with a broken nose and a proud father's mustache, who gave his name as Sir Roland and claimed to be a cousin of someone Edmure had once seen from a distance at a tourney. They took 3 men with some knowledge of accounts, and 2 who had been scouts by trade before they had found a lion pin, easier on the back than plow. The rest lay where the grass grew stained and then washed by rain. The river took some away. Edmure led it. Burying an enemy in a river country makes the river your accomplice. It will turn bone to silt without keeping a tally. Sir Roland Craighall glowered like a bull penned in a strange barn. He held his wrists stiff in the leather thong and tried to make his mustache defy the rain. "I yield," he said a second time when Brynden had put a cup of small beer in his hand. "To Lord Tywin," he added reflexively, as a man naming a patron saint. "You yield to this moment," Brynden said mildly, "which belongs to Lord Edmure. You can take your oaths to Tywin out of your pocket again later if you live to find the pocket." "Do not let him think himself wronged," Edmure said quietly. "Feed him meat and give him a dry cloak. Set him where he can see his men being treated like creatures and not like rats. When we send him back, I want him carrying a tale that does not harden Tywin's heart against surrender when the time comes to invite it." "You think in surrenders already," Brynden murmured, amusement plucking at his mouth. "You were a boy I had to drag away from the lists before he gave some knight the chance to make an example of him. Now you think in surrenders?" "I think in doors," Edmure said, "opening and closing. Surrender is a sort of door." They sent Sir Roland with a message simple as a plank. "We will not spend blood to hold you on your bank. We will spend rope and time. Come across, and we will make you pay in men, and then send you back with fewer shoes. Stay where you are, and we will make you thirsty, and tell stories to your scouts." The boy Tom of the Rills went with him, his hair combed and his new shoes too big. He kept glancing at Brynden as if hoping he might yet be allowed to stay and be a riverman, and not a courier with eyes like a fish. Brynden ruffled his head as one does a pup before sending it home to its original master. That night, before the rain slackened, a runner came from the north gate so wet that his clothes clung to him as if they had become his skin. "Lord," he panted, leaning against the stone with his whole spine. "A man at the east gate with a white flag. He says he's from the twins. Benda Wandery." "Of course he is," Brynden said before Edmure could answer. "I can smell mutton through the rain." Lord Walder's envoy was a thin Frey whose nose looked as if it had been pinched by a midwife and never let go. He had the Frey pale eyes that watched a room as if it were a table with coins left scattered on it. He bowed enough to be acceptable and not enough to be sincere. "My lord," he said, "the Lord of the Crossing sends his regards and begs to remind his good kin and his good neighbors that the twins hold a river as well, which flows into your red fork like wine into a goblet. He has heard that certain," here the envoy coughed delicately, as if glossing over a breach of etiquette, "arrangements have been made on the river that might disadvantage trade. He hopes River Run holds no ill will." "My uncle," Edmure said, "smells mutton. I smell a man who has discovered that Tywin Lannister cannot cross where he thought he could, and wishes to offer him a different road at a price set this morning, and not last week." "Bender wow." The Frey's smile sat on his face like a coin set on its edge and asked not to be breathed on. "One might say that my lord grandfather merely wishes to keep his roads civil. One cannot have fords made of hooks and strangers going hungry on one's banks. It is bad for peace." Edmure gestured to the table and the food. Brown bread, smoked river fish, a little pot of butter that looked like foregone wealth in a war. He ate, he said. I do not discuss peace with a man who is counting how much my kitchen gives him, not because I think him low, but because I cannot hear words over that loud counting. When you have eaten, tell Lord Walder that River Run holds no ill will toward merchants, only toward men who sell a road to enemies while pretending to sell it to friends. Tell him the price we set is this: keep your river closed to lion boats, and your banks closed to lion riders, and the envoy's pale eyes flickered. A flood would be an act of war. Every river is an act of war, if you do not speak its language, Brynden said, amused. Tell Lord Walder that if he wishes to take coin for a crossing, he does not own. He can be rich and dead or poor and warm. That is a choice he is good at. We will not forget a kindness, the Frey said, rising from his insincere bow. And Brynden said, low to Edmure, no, they remember kindness only when it has interest. In Tywin's pavilion the news came folded and smelled of rain. He dismissed 5 men before he spoke to Kevan alone, a conversation that looked from a distance like 2 statues being shifted on a tomb. They are not fighting, Tywin said, very soft, as if someone had insulted not him, but the order of a thing he had set upon a shelf long ago. They are holding. I had thought to eat a march. He feeds me patience. Kevan, earnest and honorable, and so loyal that he made loyalty look like the only sense left to a man when he was old, said, Brother, the men grow colder. The rain turns bread to damp leather. Half the foragers have had to come in empty-handed because men who know the river's ways have hidden everything that can be hidden and burned what cannot. They set their loaves to sleep in holes like foxes. I have seen men die of a wet chill when their cloaks had no weight to them. If we do not cross, we must move. And now, we will move, Tywin said. Not where they ask us. Not where they expect us. If the river is a door that closes, there must be a window. We will build one. He unpinned a weight from a corner of the map and shifted it 3 inches. Send Gregor to the east to make the roads angry with us. Send Adam north to harry any line of resupply they think they have, and do it with courtesy so that when we burn, it looks like an accident of weather. Send a purse to the twins full of promises and a smaller purse full of coin and a knife under the purse. Send a runner to Harrenhal. I will be told within the day how many men Roose Bolton has in a place he claims not a hole. I will be told within the day how many men. You think Bolton will sell us a knight's road? Kevan asked, not disbelieving and not complaining, merely placing the piece where it might fit. I think men like Bolton, Tywin said, know that the only coin dearer than gold is time, and I will see what he sells for which. If I cannot buy a knight, I will buy a rumor. If I cannot buy a rumor, I will make one and sell it back to them. He did not drink wine. He ate meat and bread without butter. He slept while men came in and went with news because he had taught himself to sleep in places where other men lay and stared at darkness. When he woke, he wrote 3 notes in a neat hand and sealed them with wax that cooled quickly in the damp air. He sent 1 west, 1 north, 1 south. Somewhere beyond the ring of rain, letters moved over roads and under eaves, and each would find a hand to hold it. Edmure would find none of them. He had his own moving web. The rain thinned. In its wake, the river wore a fat belt. Men's feet squelched once, twice, then found firmness as the water fell fingers' widths each hour. Ropes had to be reset, because riverbanks changed shape while men slept. And a hook thrown blind yesterday found only eel today. The boys muttered and laughed with their new confidence, and Grell whacked a calf or 2 with his staff to remind them that a river will drown a laughing boy as easily as a frightened one. In the quiet that follows labor, sorrow comes in. It came with a boy named Eyrie, a hornblower from Lord Piper's village, who had blistered his palms and made jokes about his blisters, and then turned a hot color in the cheeks, and shivered and smiled, and told a story in the wrong order, and then did not finish it. Edmure sat with him on a pallet beneath the tower, and held a cup to his lips, and knew, while he held it, that the boy was going where his mother's face could not follow. When Derry's breath left him, it did not go in any small way. It went like a tide turning in a bone cup. Edmure put a hand on the boy's hair, which was still lank with river water, and felt something in himself tilt and not quite break. "Write to his mother," Catelyn said when she found him there. "Do it yourself. Men like Utharides can write it better and will not have to stop and rub their eyes because they cannot see letters, but it should be your hand." "Gan," he wrote. It took him 3 attempts because his hand would not begin. And when it began, it wanted to go fast and say what was not true. In the end, he wrote that Derry had done his work until he could not, that he had not been alone, that a man had held his hand. He did not write that the boy had asked for his mother because a man's pride will forgive you almost anything you write except the truth about his weakness. And he had decided that grief should not have to forgive on top of everything else. Brynden came when the ink was dry. He held the paper and did not read it. Out of the courtesy, men of their house had always practiced with words that smell of salt. "We will have more letters," he said. "I know," Edmure said. "I am learning to dislike my own name where it is written at the bottom of such things." "You should dislike it nowhere else," Brynden said briskly. "A name is a rope. When it is tied to a thing that must be done, it holds. Be glad yours holds. There are men whose names slip and drag." News came. It came in at first like a cock crowing 3 fields away, and then like wind banging a shutter. The bells of King's Landing had rung, someone said. They had rung wrong. The Blackwater had burned green, and a man had laughed while it burned, and then been carried from the banks with his face black and teeth white, and his spirit scalded from smiling. Stannis had fought on the walls and at the mud gate. Or he had come by sea and walked through a door made of flame. Or he had stood and watched, while a shadow took his place on the ladder, and climbed and did work for him that made men make the sign against evil. The Tyrells had marched. The Tyrells had tarried to find a bridegroom. The Red Keep had sent no ravens, because a raven had been shot under a moon, and men had found gold in its pouch, and then killed themselves over the gold. Edmure listened to all of it, and plucked away invention until only this remained in his hand, thin as a fish's rib. King's Landing had been at the very edge. If Tywin had left the river and moved when his first impulse told him to, he would have been at the Blackwater by now with an ally to bring the Rose and the Lion together. He had not. He was here. The door was closing another finger's width. That night Brynden took a handful of men upriver in coracles. Skin boats light enough to carry on a shoulder, and round enough to make a man respect the least ripple. They went barefoot to make less noise with the ribs of the craft. They blackened their faces with ash and river mud because there was no sense in making golden targets of themselves. They slid among the reeds and made small soft knocks with their paddles under the bellies of 3 Lannister river skins tied to a snag. A sleeping man snored inside one. Brynden's hand paused a moment at the sound. Sleep is a sacred thing, even in enemies, and then moved on, because war is a more jealous god. Knives sawed soundless. Ropes that thought they would hold loosened. In the morning, 3 boats would be seen below the mill's apron, bumping like fat fish, and a story would be told among tired men that the river had had a temper in the night. Men who are persuaded that the river has moods are men who waste energy arguing with water. At dawn, a raven did come from the south. Shabby, as if it had flown through smoke. It had no seal worth trusting. It had the breathless tone of rumors that can feel themselves on the edge of becoming news. King's Landing had not fallen. It had not been saved cleanly either. The words were tumbled. Green fire. Chains in the water. Ships burning. A ride over a bridge of bodies. A banner seen. Gold and rose. The rose had leaned toward the lion. Someone had shouted, "Marguerite," in a place where screaming was fashionable that day. Loud little details crept in, the way mice creep in when doors are closed and men are looking somewhere else. Edmure read it and felt an old tightness return, not in despair, but in that sobriety men feel when they have taken a hill and discovered that the world is a range of them. "He will try to break for the south now," he said, when Brynden had glanced down the page and made the face men make at wet shoes. "Or for the west twice as hard," Brynden said. "The roses give him courage. He will think to leave us bruised and comfort himself with his new friend at table. The road to the city is longer for him than it was 3 days ago. But the road to the rock is shorter if he can make the river stop crawling into his boots. Then we will let him think one road has fewer thorns, Edmure said. And when Brynden turned his head to listen, he spoke the plan. It was simple, because a river likes simple actors. They would dress the bend near Seven Streams the way a poacher dresses a path. Leave sign to suggest neglect. Leave mud smooth, and then scuffed the way a tired man scuffs it when he goes to piss. Leave a barrel with its bung out so the smell of old ale would make men think of thirst and think themselves safe enough to laugh. Rope would lie under the skin again, but this time there would be fewer hooks near the middle and more near the sides, so that the crossing would feel kind at first, and then turn mean. Upstream, 2 mill ponds had been coaxed into cooperation with the promise of payment. Their keepers would pull sluices at a signal, and the river would lift her skirts an inch, and then another when no one expected it. The men from Fairmarket would bring down a clog, a raft of brush and timbers tied to sink, and then float at a certain weight, to strike the crossing just when the best men were 2/3 over. On the far bank where the ground was higher, a trench had been started, and then disguised with brush and silt. The first ranks over would trip and curse, and the ones behind would stumble, and then the ones behind them would push, because men hate to think anyone else is doing something while they are not. We do not want to slaughter, Edmure said, marking lines in the mud with a stick, as if he were a boy drawing a battle he had dreamed. We want to cut. If we take a tail, a head might go in a different direction than it thought. If we lop a foreleg, the beast will favor the other and leave the path we have chosen. We will try to take captains. We will offer the men who cannot swim ropes at the last, so they remember the river as a stern aunt, not a stepmother with a switch. Mentor, you have made mercy into policy, Brynden said. The words not contemptuous but edged with a test. I am paying forward, Edmure said simply. We will need men to lay down arms if we mean to shepherd this country into anything but a boneyard, and men do not lay down arms for a butcher unless he is standing on their necks. I do not have the neck to stand on all their throats at once. Now. Very well, Brynden said, satisfied aloud and smiling slightly into his beard. We will do it your way, which, as I am obliged to say, is the river's way. They did it at sunset, because a river will forgive many things in the half-light, and betray you only with glimmers. The first Lannister files came cautious and then comforted, stepping high like cranes in shallows. One man laughed when his boot found a firm place. It was a soft laugh, meant only for his next man, but it infected those behind. When the laugh reached the 10th file, it turned brazen. When it reached the 20th, it turned into a song that had been rude in a tavern and became brave in the open. The rope took the first weights and said nothing. The men stepped. They thought themselves clever because their feet were dry. Men love dry feet like a second wife. The river took the first debt in small coins. A slip, a splash, a curse swallowed by water. Then she took larger ones. The clog floated down as if it had forgot its errand and then remembered it perfectly. Its nose lifted like a dog scenting meat, and struck the crossing in the place where the ropes were old friends to one another. Hooks that had lain like dead eels woke and gnashed. The bridge went soft-kneed, and then men went where the river meant for them to go. On the far side, the first ranks did find the trench, and went forward into it with the energy that men bring to every mistake. They tumbled and cursed. Those behind climbed them. The first archers who had thought to make a line found that their footings were littered with half-stood men, and they adjusted, because men can learn even when insulted. They raised their bows and met Edmure's measured rain of arrows with their own bright answer. It was not glorious. It was ugly work done with breath and curses, and the bite of bowstrings on fingers. In the middle, where the river was now hungry, 2 standards tilted. One with a red lion on gold, one with a boar that had been black and now was wet and ugly. The boar sank until only its snout showed. The lion floundered and then lurched toward a place that looked like safety and was not. A man went down under it with a sound like a bark. Someone shouted Roland's name, but the man they had captured was drinking beer in a dry cloak in River Run and thinking of a letter he would write his cousin if he were given back to his own. "Now the tale," Brynden said. And the men who had been placed at the edges surged with a precision that came from long muddy days. They went not for the brave center with its lion and its singing, but for the parts that make a body move. The captains counting where their men were. The men with the long horns who turned pushes into retreats and retreats into routes. A riverman put a hook to a horn and pulled it out of the hand of a boy who had given that horn all his breath since dawn. The boy looked at his empty hand like a man who has been told his name is wrong. He lived. He would tell the story in a tavern one day until he made himself into a hero, and then catch himself and take a drink in memory of the men who had not learned to make their own lives into stories. They cut the tale and let it go. It thrashed and went into the shallows where the ropes had no teeth and the water had no interest. Men on both sides made the calculations men make. What is the cost? What is the gain? Where is pride cheaper than sense? Enough on the far bank laid down their spears with the wall of the trench behind them that the rest decided to be brave somewhere else. Lannister men on the near bank pulled their fellows out of the water by their belts, because a man who saves one man believes himself owed some coin by the world, and is easier to bargain with tomorrow than a handful of dead boys. When the light failed, the river became one thing again instead of a dozen little separate plans. Darkness rescues what pride cannot. Both sides eased off. Men cursed in the long way that means relief and not malice. Ropes were coiled. Hooks were wiped and oiled. Names were said aloud and went on the list of those who would have to be sent home in brown ink and clean words. Edmure stood quieter than his own breath and let the ache in his knees announce itself. He felt not triumph but a sober completion, a sense that he had pulled the thing taut and tied it, and now the knot must hold on its own. In Tywin's pavilion the map grew new scars. He moved his weights and did not show his face to the men he sent out with orders, because a man like Tywin believed faces should be rationed the way meat was, given when they fed and withheld when they would only confuse. He would, Edmure knew, try to turn the door they had made into a hinge. He would look for a night of frost that would make the river mean to wood and kind to iron. He would buy a man with a daughter in need of dowry, and not ask what the man planned to do with the money. He would do all of that, and the river would still be here. In the morning a rider came from the west, so wet with sweat and mud that it took a moment to see the stark direwolf on his breast. He slid from the saddle in the yard and his knees buckled. He laughed once without humor, and then remembered to salute. Edmure went down to him with Brynden at his back. "From the king?" the rider said, and thrust a leather case at Edmure with two hands, as if he had been carrying a baby that might yet bite. His hair was plastered to his head and his eyes were salt red. "From the young wolf," he says. "Hold," he says. "If they turn their head to you, I will have their tail." He says, "If they turn their tail to you, I will have their head." Then too, Edmure broke the seal and took in Robb's hand. Plain and neat, and not so different from Hoster's when his father had written Edmure the letters that had made him straighten his shoulders and weep in the same day. Hold, dight. He would. He had. He went very still and let the breath he'd been holding go without sound. "Tell him," he said to the rider, mostly to give the man something to take back that would make his pain into a story he could like, "that the river is ours today, and we will lend him her temper when he needs it. Tell him the door has another inch in it. They say," the rider blurted, as if to lighten his own pouch of words, "they say Stannis was at the gate, and then the roses came, and the lion roared, and the sea caught fire. They say a boy king shot a man himself, and then cried, or did not cry. They say a man in a red cloak was seen with green light on his teeth. They say—" "Let them say," Brynden said, kind and final. "We are not there to see their lies dressed in truth. We are here where rope is rope. Go to the kitchens. Eat. Sleep under the eaves. We will send you back with something more than a word to carry." He went. Edmure stood with the letter in his hand and felt a small heat in his chest that was not pride and not fear. It was the knowledge that someone he loved in the world where the world was busy and ugly had understood the same door he had, and that they were, for a little while, its two hands, and could shut it as one shuts a chest with a treasure in it. They held through another day of men and water. They held when Gregor's men tried to ford at a place where a deer track made a pretty line. The deer had been lighter and less impatient. They held when Frey scouts were seen skulking with looks that would sell their mothers, and then cry about it. They held when a Lannister trumpeter began to play a body song between orders, and Mark Piper, eyes alight, answered with a Riverlands tune filthier and grander, and then was smacked by Grell and told to save wind for war. They held when Jason Mallister sent word that a Tywin letter had been intercepted near Saltpans promising coin to a ferryman who had already drowned 2 years ago. Tywin's letters were clever, not omniscient. They held when the rain stopped and the air filled with insects, and laughter came back to men like a stolen spoon found in a pocket. That night Edmure walked the godless godswood again, and the pool held a slice of moon too thin to be of comfort, and yet somehow a comfort anyway. He thought of Hoster. He thought of the way his father's hand had once covered his whole scalp when he was a boy, and had clapped him hard for coming home with hair full of burrs, and then had turned the clap to a stroke, because anger is brittle in men who love. He thought of Catelyn's voice and how it held iron without cruelty, and of Robb's letters and how they made him both remember and forget the boy who had once been too long for his chair and bored his way through a feast. He thought of winter, real winter, with the river locked and speaking a glass tongue, and of whether this work would carry into that season, whether ropes would stiffen and snap, and men would learn a new vocabulary of hard cold. When he turned, Brynden was there, as if the godswood grew him the way it grew hawthorn. "They will not stop trying," he said. "I do not mean them to," Edmure said. "A river without pressure becomes a mirror and shows men their own faces too clearly. Let them press. It makes us clever." Brynden chuckled. "You sound as if you plan to write a book." "Only letters," Edmure said. "Too many of them. To boys' mothers, to men's widows, to lords who think themselves owed and to woodcutters who are owed and not used to it. Do this long enough," Brynden said, "and we will owe ourselves a night without counting. Not tonight." His head turned at some sound beyond, some shift in the air that only men like him, bread thin as a knife on war's whetstone, ever heard. "Tomorrow," he said, not promising and not denying, and went. Toward dawn a cold wind came downriver with the smell of stone and fern and far chalk. The water shivered in a way that had nothing to do with men. Edmure leaned on the parapet and felt it. A change unrelated to quills and orders. A change that belonged to the land the way a man's breath belongs to his chest. The flood that had fattened their ally had spent itself. The red fork gathered itself smaller and quicker, and found its old cunning again beneath a thinner skin. It was a different river. They would have to learn it again today, as if yesterday had been a story told to children, and not a lesson told at sword point. He smiled, not because he liked changing stories. He did not, but because the smile was for himself, for the man who could feel the change and not panic at it. The bells had rung somewhere south where a river he had never loved had burned green. The lion had found a rose to lean against. The wolf had sent him a letter with a single word weighty as iron. And the river, which owed no man anything, had decided to be sharp again. He would meet it where it was. He would put his men's feet on places that had been slick yesterday and firm today. He would hold. Behind him, the castle breathed, and the smell of oats came, and the noise of boots, and the first small brag of a boy to a girl who had carried water all night, and was therefore twice as mighty as any lord. Day came as it always did, with light on stone and the clap of hands, and the first curse and the first laugh. Edmure Tully straightened his back and went to the wall, and took up the business of shutting a door no man could see and every man would feel. Yeah, Kay. The river had learned a new language overnight. Where it had been swollen and blunt, it spoke now in quick syllables, in under eddies that lifted one way and then another like a flock turning as one bird. The stakes that had bitten clean yesterday showed their points above a skin gone taut. Ropes that had sagged heavy as soaked hair came up with a spring if a man hauled too hard. Men cursed and laughed and adjusted, and the laughter had a relief in it, like breath after a stitch. Edmure moved along the parapet with Brynden and Desmond Grell, and made his throat learn the river's new tone. "Reset the second line at Harrows," he said. after watching the current tug at a snarl of reeds, as if plucking a harp. We take the hooks up 2 hands' breadth. When the red fork slims, she grows teeth near the edges. Main. Grell said, and the boys who'd slept with their fingers curled around line and woke with tar under their nails ran to do it. Tito's Blackwood sent a raven with its feathers ruffled by mischief, rather than rain. A quick hand had scrawled that a Lannister scout had tried the old ford below Greygate at dawn and gone down so slow he'd had time to be embarrassed in 3 different ways. They are remeasuring, Blackwood wrote. Let them. My son has learned to say nothing with his eyes, which is the first thing a Blackwood ought to learn. We hold. Mansion. Jason Mallister sent word on salt-dry parchment that a pair of lion-painted boats had put their noses round a spit of coast north of Seaguard, sniffing the wind like dogs. He had sent gulls to nip them. They had fled with dignity, the way men flee when their pride is reading the faces of the men left behind. Your river runs to my sea, Mallister wrote in a neat knight's hand. I will keep its mouth unsoured. Edmure read both messages to Brynden under the lee of the East Tower, where the sun made a small brightness on wet stone. He is counting our quiet as defeat, Edmure said. Of Tywin. If he does not cross today, he will write more letters. If he does, he means to make the crossing the letter. Brynden sniffed the wind as if there might be ink in it. Letters by road if the road is men. Which brings me to a matter the river doesn't teach. And no. He gave it the way he gave bad news, flat as a board, so the man receiving it might decide for himself if it were heavy. During the night, a man from Cobble Ridge had been seen by Blackfish's own men slipping from the reeds to the King's Road, with his cloak tied up and a purse straining at its thong. He had walked with the cautious rapidity of a thief who believes himself honest. He had a ferryman's hands, calloused where oars turn in a man's grip. He had been followed to a barn where a boy in red and gold braid waited with a tired horse. He had not been killed. He had been watched to see who he bowed to. Sell safety, Brynden said. Dry. He'd take a coin to tell a lion what parts of a river make a man feel confident when he ought not to. Edmure's stomach tightened the way a knot takes a last turn. What would you do with him? What suits you, Brynden said. If you hang him, you'll frighten 3 more careful ones into silence. If you buy him back, you buy him twice. If you make him see the river drown a man he likes, you will have him for a month, and then he will find a way to decide the lion is a better man to do business with. Then I will untie the knot, Edmure said. We feed his wife. We tell him we will flood his meadow if he sells our water. We set our own man beside him in his boat and let him take a Lannister across where we want a Lannister to cross. We make him our rope. That, Brynden said, with a mild satisfaction that warmed more than a clap on the shoulder, is the river's way. We'll do it by 7 streams. The ground there lets us shape a mistake and call it luck. Then Paman. They set the trap with all the small attentions that made men call a work careful. A line of stakes a foot back from where the old ford lay. A tangle of brush pinned by stones where a desperate man would put his hand. A willow waited so it would fall when a knife touched an unassuming thong. When the ferryman, Geddan, that was his name, brought the first 2 red-cloaked scouts across at dusk, he whistled without thinking at the easy footing, and was pleased with himself for thinking of a place the river had forgotten. He did not see the way Brynden's men lay in the ditch with their faces blacked and their eyes half-lidded like owls. He did not see the rope under the skin any more than the 2 scouts did. He saw only his own luck, which is the most blinding thing a man can look at straight on. They let the pair go back. They did not touch them, and the men did not turn their heads, which told Edmure what sort of scouts Tywin had kept back for this work, sober ones. They came with a dozen the second time, and that was the number the river and Edmure liked. The rope took the weight. The willow went with a soft sigh and made a different current across the men's shins, just enough to shift a stance. Arrows whispered, and then ceased. More a caution than a cull. Hooks had the work they preferred, taking men by surprise and making them think water had opinions. They took the 2 dozen in the ditch mostly whole. One bit Brynden through the palm and had a tooth knocked out for it, and seemed grateful when given a rag to hold in his mouth to stop the bleeding. Geddan stood on the far bank as if he had forgotten what his legs were for. When Brynden gestured him over, he came like a dog called, shaking. "Lord," he stammered, fierce with shame before Edmure could say anything that would taste of condescension. "I did not think. I thought." "You thought the lion would pay you again next week," Edmure said, not ungently. "He might. Oh. He might pay you for your daughter, and then come back in 2 years and take the price again as a lesson. Because men like that believe money does not end, and a man like you is coin with legs. Instead, you will take our coin. We count slower, and we pay in supper. You will sit on your bench and watch the river, and nod when we nod. If you nod any other day, I will flood your meadow, and then flood it again. I will give you a cow then, so you can feed your family while you look at the ruin you made." Now, he did not need to tell Geddon that Brynden had him measured for a rope and a prayer. The man's eyes said he knew. "Ay," Geddon said. "Ay, my lord." "Good," Edmure said, and meant the word less for the ferryman than for the moment the river had been persuaded to keep long enough for them to use. Catelyn found him in the yard later, with a woman's walk that is not the same as a man's war walk, but has its own iron. Brienne was a solemn height at her shoulder, her sword rapped against the damp, her face equal parts sorrow and attention. The sight of them, the woman who had taught him when to swallow anger and when to stand on it, and the woman who had been honed by devotion into a weapon no one had ordered, tightened something in him that the river could not teach nor ease. "They say you took men with a willow and a good lie," Catelyn said, a flicker of pride warming her words. "I took men with their own eagerness," Edmure said. "We only made them a place to put it down." Brienne's eyes moved to the wall, to the ropes, to the boys hauling, to the hook ends stacked neat as bread on a baker's slab. "You have taught hooks to be honorable," she said, and if the words would have been awkward from another mouth, from hers they were blunt and therefore acceptable. "I have taught them to be useful," Edmure said, and Brienne's mouth pressed a little, as if that answer fit her own understanding of honor. Catelyn touched his arm. "Our father asks for you when he sleeps." She said, the way one hands a man an heirloom knife. "He says your name in a voice from 30 years ago, and then he says another name in a voice I do not know." "Tansy," Edmure said, and the word lay on his tongue like a pebble he had picked up as a boy and not known why, only that it had felt smooth and useful. He saw the shadow that flickered in Catelyn's face and did not push at it. There were doors one closed, because opening them would make a winter in a room where men needed a hearth. He wrote 3 letters that night, to Derry's mother, telling her what men tell mothers in understanding. While he wrote, that none of it was enough. To Jason Mallister, thanking him for keeping the river's mouth honest, and telling him that fish were biting in places, had never seen them in autumn. To Rob, a single page, plain as a spear shaft. "We hold, and the lion gnaws his own teeth." Near dawn, men came out of the fog on the far bank, with the surety of a plan bought with long coin. They brought not brush this time, but floating trestles anchored with stones, built in an hour with carpenter's hands and a captain's temper. The trestles had ropes sunk along their sides for men to seize, a neat thought. The men had their shields tied to their backs with cords so they could use both hands, a neat thought. There were men with axes to cut whatever the river had learned to hold, a neat thought. The neatness would have made Edmure almost fond in peacetime. In war, it made him let the men come 2 lengths further into the river than pride-like. There is a point where a plan becomes a habit. It was there he threw his weight. The first rope went tight at a command half hidden in a cough. Brynden had learned to speak under wind. Hooks, that had been sunk shyly now, came up in bright anger. The carpenter's neat trestles turned out to have opinions when a river told them they did. Stones slung in makeshift slings from the south bank came down, not on men's heads, which would waste good anger, but on the trestles' joints. Wood complained. Joints sighed. One of the trestles lifted like a cat whose tail had been trod on and then went soft. The rope that held 3 shields in place on a man's back bound all 3 to the weight that took him by the knees and did not let him choose which part of him went first. The axeman swung. A hook took an axe haft halfway to its bite and made a new thought for that man about the relationship between iron and wood. At the crossing where the tumbling water called men names, when they slipped and had names to call them still when they tried again, a golden lion standard stepped forward with the stubborn dignity of a man making a point. It bore the Lefford sun on its leader's breast. Edmure had watched the square set of that jaw for 3 days from 3 different distances. He liked the way Lord Lefford had not wasted his men to teach a river manners. He did not admire the way the man came now, because the river was not in a mood to admire anyone. Lefford made a space for his men with his own body, and then filled it with them, and then tried to cross into a place where the water said, no. He did not turn back when men shouted names at him. He put his head down as if the current were a rumor and not a force, and the river respected that long enough to get him over the first worst. Brynden looked at Edmure and lifted his brows. Edmure said, "Take him as you would a stag, not as you would a fly." The horn spoke 3 small syllables. The men at the edges moved with the patience they had practiced in rain. When Lefford's horse shouldered up out of water and made the ground look simple, the ground failed him. His mount went down to the knee. The knee meant to become a gallop, and his men tripped over his effort, and the stakes they had planted to make a bridge stay true made their own idea of truth. They held just long enough to snarl 3 files, and then let go together. The lion standard tilted. A boy in iron who could not bear to see a lion tilt lifted it, and had it out of the mud, and a hook in his arm, and a memory he would never quite be able to think without sweat. They cut Lefford out of the center like a careful butcher taking a shoulder without spoiling a ham. It was ugly and neat, and done without glory. 2 of the men who got hands on his bridle died in the next minute, because the next minute is when all plans get punished by the world. But Lefford went down with 3 men on him, and came up with his face gray and his breath going in ragged bites. He did not shout that he yielded. He looked at the water and at the hooks and the gravel and the pricked line of archers under the eaves, and understood that a river makes a man humble faster than an army does. He put his sword down like a man putting his child in a bed he does not own. Brynden took it and gave him water and did not smile, because a man like Lefford does not deserve a smile at that moment. Only a witness. "Lord," Brynden said, his courtesy as smooth and old as the leather on a saddle, "if you will come out of the wet, we will talk ransom in a place where a man can hear his own sense." Lefford stared behind him toward the far bank where men built courage out of shouting. He stared in front of him toward the near bank where the shouting was not loud because the work did not permit it. He nodded once, as if someone had told him the price of a thing he had decided to buy on credit. Tywin's tent did not tremble when the news came. It would not tremble if the world burned its guy ropes. He did not throw a cup. He did not break a chair. He put a weight on a different corner of the map and looked at a line he had not cared for yesterday. "Lord Lefford is a good man," he said. "The way a man says a prayer he does not believe in, but remembers the shape of. We will have him again. Send a quiet man to treat. A quiet man, mind you. No one who thinks he will be famous because he paid coin for a lord. That is him, no." Kevin found such a man because Tywin had always collected quiet men the way other men collect songs. The man spoke with Utherdy's wain in a corner of the yard where smoke from the kitchen made men cough, and therefore kept them from gossip. The numbers that moved between their hands were not ruinous, because Edmure held to a policy. He would bleed their wealth without teaching them that dying would be cheaper. Lefford went into the stone under guard with meat in his bowl, and a dry cloak on his shoulders, and his men taken from him, and put with other men who had made the mistake of thinking the river would bargain. He ate, and did not look at the door more than twice in an hour. Brynden wrapped his sword neat and took it away to be kept dry, not put on a hall's wall to boast. When he gave Lefford a cup of mulled ale, Lefford said without bitterness, "Your nets are better than mine, fish?" Brynden tipped his head, as if a compliment from a man he'd netted were a coin he would not spend and would not throw away. "Our river is older than your roads," he said. At dusk, a noise came in from the north gate. Not alarm, not triumph, but the low hum that means men have come in who carry weather on their cloaks. Roose Bolton's banner was not among them, but 3 of the men wore the pin of Harrenhal's current lord. That place had a habit of changing lords the way a drunk changes lies. They came thin, with eyes like knives, and asked for meat as men do, who do not know if the asking will be counted as insolence. They brought a letter for Edmure sealed with pale wax and without a sigil. He opened it under Bryndon's eye. The hand was small, perfect, and cold. Lord Bolton wrote that the ruins of Harrenhal were dry where they were broken, and wet where they were whole. He wrote that ravens had flown in and out carrying tales for whichever side paid them in scraps of meat and vanity. He wrote that a man in Tywin's camp had asked where the river made a respectful bend, and that Bolton had said what men say when they wish to keep their throat clean, and their hands clean, and their choices ambiguous. The river bends where it wishes. He offered no help and no hindrance. He named no prices. He had written a letter like a still pond. A man could throw a stone in and only know what sort of stone he had by the sound it made. "Good," Bryndon said, folding it and handing it back as if that had been exactly the letter he had expected. If he were friendly, he would be more dangerous. If he were an enemy, he would be easier to plan around. As he is, he holds a mirror to men and lets them make mistakes in it. Edmure sent back a loaf, a crock of butter, and a message in his own hand. If you hear the river speak sense, listen. If you hear it speak gold, know that it is a man trying to make it say what he needs to buy. The phrase sniffed at every wind. Walder's envoy came again with cheeks pink from a hearth he did not own, and a new humility as thin as a spring thaw. He spoke of marriages as a man selling reeds at a flood. He hinted at tolls and bridges and custom, and the terrible cruelty of watching trade falter. Edmure fed him and sent him home with a ham and a warning. Do not put your foot on a plank you do not own. The envoy bowed like a man with a broom in his back and went. The day after Lefford went into stone, Tywin tried a thing men with gold always attempt when iron refuses them. He sent 4 boats down from different bends at once, each carried by men with oars that had been rubbed with oil to keep water from swelling them, each bristling near the gunwales with boards to act as teeth when they touched a bank. 2 were decoys. 2 had men worth ransoming in them, men with more silk on their backs than sense behind their eyes. Bryndon had laid nets the night before. Not nets like fishermen use. Those would have been torn by weight and pride. But nets made of rope with knots large enough to take a handhole. They lay under water like quiet counsel, and then rose up at a whistle, like old men rising from chairs. 1 boat slid past with a cursing oarsman spitting river, and a hooked plank curving out like a scythe. It caught nothing but weeds and a boy's hat, and was let go. The 2nd boat turned as if insulted and drove itself nose first into a bank that had been made soft by hands in the night, and took root there like a tree. The 3rd tangled in a net, and found itself traveling at the river's preference, not the men's. When it struck the south bank, it did so in a way that made 3 men fall forward into the arms of their enemies with more dignity than they'd expected. The 4th, which had thought itself clever for being the boat no one looked at, went neatly between 2 anchored lines and was swarmed there by men with hooks and knives who spoke to it as they would to a stubborn pig, reasoning first, then instruction. At sunset that day, after the boats had been pulled up, after the prisoners had been counted and sorted, after Lefford had been given mulled ale and sat in silence, while the steam rose into his mustache like a ghost of comfort, Edmure went up to the high tower where his father lay. Hoster Tully's breaths came with an old sailor's stubbornness, unwilling to quit but uninterested in giving satisfaction to the sea. His beard had gone the color of riverstone. His eyes opened when Edmure's shadow moved across the bed. For a moment, nothing in them belonged to the present. Then his son's face gathered itself from the past and sat there. You have your mother's mouth when you are stubborn, Hoster said, surprisingly clear. You do not know it. You cannot. She would make you stand in the river until you learned the current, and then pull you out when you thought you were doing it yourself. I am doing it myself, Edmure said, because he had sacrificed too many pounds of pride on the river's altar to pretend humility he did not feel. Hoster said. His hand moved as if it weighed more than his arm could account for, and found Edmure's fingers. Do not spend men whose names you could say in the dark. Spend gold. Spend pride. Spend time. Spend yourself last. He closed his eyes, and a whisper like the memory of a person escaped him. A name that had never belonged to Edmure, but had lived for years under the skin of the house. "Tansy," he said, not to the room. Edmure sat a long time after that, his hand on his father's, and thought of what one spends and what one saves. When he stood, he felt that standing as if it belonged to another man he respected. Dawn came with a thin frost that silvered reeds and turned breath to smoke. Men in the yard stamped and slapped arms and made stupid jokes about warming each other's backsides with charity. The river wore the frost lightly and then shrugged it off. Offended, Edmure felt the cat-quick bite in the air and saw how it was teaching Tywin to be bold again. Men believe iron will behave better when the air is cold. He sent more pitch to the lines so knots would not go brittle. He told Grell to change the angle on every third stake, so that any man who thought he had learned a pattern would be corrected by pain rather than water. He set boys to carry smooth stones, warm from the cookhouse, under their armpits to keep fingers nimble. It was a worthless comfort, but men will do what a lord commands and like the doing of it if it warms something. At noon, Tywin feigned a retreat in his left, bright lion banners easing back along the red fork as if insulted, and slammed his right at Cobble Ridge with a weight of men that made the ground groan. He had learned patience. He threw it down to see if it would break. He sent axemen with peasant boots and knightly shoulders. He sent a clutch of men in leather jerkins, with crooked knives, who knew how to cut rope underwater because someone had taught them the way a man teaches a polite son to hold a knife at table. He sent one company of crossbowmen to keep the heads down at the bank. Good bolts, true fletching, moving not in volleys but in patient pairs. He sent a man in a gilded helm to make men braver by being visible and disposable in the same instant. Edmure let it all come. He tasted iron and sap, and thought of his father's hand and the way Lefford had looked at the ground before nodding. He signaled here, and a rope lifted and then fell slack so a man's instinct would carry him 2 steps into a grave that had not existed when he was born. He signaled there, and the pitch-lighted cord took fire where it crossed water and burned oily and spiteful. Not to harm men but to show them how a line lay so they would not trust it. He signaled again, and men who had never had a plan in their lives did the little parts of his and made it into one thing. The axemen cut. 2 went under when they cut rope that held nothing, and then felt the something that had waited beyond it. The crossbows sang and men bowed their heads and then lifted them when Grell's boys threw up mantlets of wet hides that drank bolts like thirsty cows. A man in a gilded helm lifted it on its strap and threw it to the bank when it caught a glancing blow that turned his ear to fire. He went on bareheaded and men followed him because he had been foolish, and that sort of courage is catching. Brynden found the foolish brave and knocked him cold with the flat of a hook and had him hauled out by his boots. "We have enough dead heroes," he said to the man's slack mouth. "We need live fools." They ground Tywin there until the sound changed, the difference between an engine biting and a wheel spinning. Then Edmure raised his hand and took the weight off the rope with a long steady pull, and the men who thought they had at last learned the current put their feet down into a nothing they had not expected, and swore in voices that were nearly grateful. So surprised were they to be still breathing. They drew back. They did not scatter. Tywin's men never scattered. They drew back with their pride straight as spears, and Edmure let them, because nothing is cheaper to let a man keep than his posture. Near evening, a small thunder ran the north bank. Horses. Not many. Swift. D'Artois. A messenger with the stark wolf on him. This one was not smelling of salt and a long road but of pine and young courage. He slid from the saddle as if the saddle had never been any different from his own back, and would have fallen if Brienne had not been at Catelyn's shoulder and caught him by the collar like a big sister. "From the king," he said, breath plumbing. Edmure took the leather case, aware with an odd tenderness of the boy's ribs, and of the way his eyes looked not at Edmure's face but at the ground, as if the ground were the only loyal thing left in the world. Robb's hand again. Robb's voice that had learned to be a man's without forgetting what it was to be a son. "I have the west stirring like a breached hive," he wrote. "If Tywin opens his mouth to you, I will close it from behind. If he shows you his teeth, I will pull them. Do not starve your men to feed his pride. Hold, I will spend my own pride for us both if I must." There was a line at the margin, scratched in later. "Tell mother, I keep both hands on my sword and my temper, and that I have not thrown either." Edmure smiled without heat. He sent the boy to the kitchen to be fed as if he were one of his own, because he was one of his own, and stood on the wall at last light and watched the river put a thin skin of pewter over its earnest brown. The world beyond the banks had gone mad with green fire and bells and roses that leaned toward lions. Here, rope was rope, stone was stone. Men were handfuls of breath, and the things they chose to hold when water argued with them. Tywin did not sleep, or if he did, he made no one feel it. He sent a runner east with a purse that had clinked a dozen times, and would clink a dozen more before it reached a hand that meant to take it. He sent another north with a letter that looked like an apology, and was in fact an invoice. He sent Adam Marbrand to nip at edges until the edges bled, and Roose Bolton to admire his own stillness in a ruin that had once been a king's idea. He sent word to the twins that amounts had been reconsidered, and a man might be made young again by gold. Walder Frey, in his tower that had learned to sag without crumbling, held 2 coins up to the light, and saw a different face on each and did not fancy either. The river below him was low enough that a man who knew a cosseted horse's knees would not like to ask that horse to try crossing. He sent his pale-eyed envoy back to Riverrun with a lean expression that meant the price would not be cut, only renamed. Edmure fed the envoy again. Bread ham. The butter now tasted of garlic's grell had coaxed from a frost-browned bed, and sent him away with a pair of good boots. "Ace a token," he said blandly. "Roads are muddy." "Kindness," Brynden murmured when they were alone. "It has a price. You are teaching men to count it." "I am teaching myself," Edmure said. "It's the only counting I can afford without hating what it buys." Night pulled their work into itself. Stars came in thin handfuls. The river felt the cold from far hills and tightened its skin, as if to keep its heat near its bones. Men kept watch in pairs, because a man alone with a river will begin to think a river is talking to him. And then he will argue back, and that way lies grief. Edmure dozed in a chair with his boots off for the first time in 3 days, and woke to shafts of light through a shutter and the smell of onions and bacon and sharp soap, where a boy had been set to scrub the floor so his nerves would have work that did not involve fear. By mid-morning, a mist rose, not thick enough to hide a man, thick enough to make his outline a story men would argue over. Tywin pushed men through it in 4 ranks, each 10 paces apart, so that when one line learned a lesson, the next had time to decide whether to learn it as well. He had sent men in pairs bound with a short length of cord, so they would not be separated by a river that loved to separate. The first bound pair went down when one lost his footing, and the other learned that loyalty is a fine word on dry ground and a bad idea in water. Men with knives cut cords, and men with hooks cut cords, and for a moment the 2 sorts of men were cousins. Edmure's calm marched before his orders. He had learned to let his face hold nothing and his hands hold the rest. He felt the tug on the last coil he had laid himself. A fine line hidden and near. The tug said a weight the size of a man had thought itself safe. He raised his hand once. Boys in reeds, who had grown a foot in a week and had begun to believe themselves men, took the line and shifted it an inch. That inch was enough. The second rank went into the first in a way that taught knees humility. The third rank planted and made a little island. Edmure fed it 3 arrows and then silence. The 4th rank stopped. The horn sounded the retreat. Not shameful, only true. Men backed with difficulty and did not look as if they preferred going forward. Edmure let them. By evening a scribe might have written that nothing had happened that day. The door had moved another finger's width. The lion had eaten rain and taken pride for supper. A lord's son who had whistled crossing a river, he thought his friend had ceased to whistle and would not whistle again over water. A boy named Derry had been buried. A ferryman named Geddon had sold his river once, and then found that the river would not have it. A lord named Lefford had drunk ale and said nothing, and been treated as if his nothing mattered. A wolf had written hold in a hand that looked like a father's when a father was young. At the last, when the stars came and each looked like a nail driven into a black door, Edmure stood where the hawthorn grew and watched the red fork smooth her skirts with both hands. He thought of winter coming down like a long iron lid. He thought of ropes freezing and stakes turning brittle. He thought of Tywin counting time like coin and deciding which to spend and how loudly. He thought of Robb in the west with bees in his sleeve and honey on his tongue for the houses that would sting him if he reached wrong. He thought of Catelyn's hand on his sleeve, and of Brienne's stillness, and of Hoster's breath turning into a different man's name, and then back again. He did not pray. He did not know words for that would not spoil the silence. He put his hand out and touched the hawthorn's bark where frost would seam it in a month, and said to it, "Because hawthorn is as old as any god in a river country, hold." The river breathed in the dark. Somewhere beyond it, a lion softly cursed his own patience. Somewhere above it a raven opened and shut its black book and decided not to write tonight. The door waited, and the hands on either side of it, wolf and trout, kept their places, not touching yet, ready to close when the Uder's wait came.